everyone. On behalf of the On Being Project and the Washington National Cathedral, welcome to Poetry Unbound Plus with Pádraig Ó Tuama, featuring our special guest poet tonight, or this afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you're joining us from, Diane Glancy. We're so thrilled to have Diane with us, and we're glad that you're here for this time of opening our hearts and imaginations in a conversation about poetry and the literature of the Bible. So whether you're here for your first Poetry Unbound Plus, or you've been a part of all four parts of this series, welcome. My name is Ben Cott, and I'm the Associate Director of Religious Life and Social Healing at the On Being Project. On Being is a nonprofit media and public life initiative pursuing deep thinking and moral imagination, social courage and joy to renew inner life, outer life, and life together. I'm joining you today from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland. And as we begin, we want to acknowledge that plenty of us here are living on lands that have histories much older than the current occupants' arrival. So for you, we invite you to learn more about native land you're living on, and we're dropping a link where you can find out more. So as people continue to arrive to the event, we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. You can share your name, share where you're located right now, including the native lands where you reside, if that's the case and you're aware. And also feel free to share any information on what you do or any organizations that you're a part of that may be relevant to why you're here with us today. So I'll be walking us through some Zoom details in a moment, though I'm sure many of you are familiar with Zoom at this point. We want to make sure that everyone has the most comfortable experience possible and can be present to the conversation. But before we get to that conversation, know that my colleague Lily Benowitz is providing updates in the chat right now, and you can feel free to reach out to Lily directly if you have any questions or needs right now. As we gather in this virtual space today, and in our chat and Q&A later, we want to invite you to strive to embody what here at the On Being Project we call our 6 grounding virtues. And these guide everything we do. Lily's putting them in the chat. And we want to name that we're grateful to so many of our friends in the social healing community who use these grounding virtues in their work as they gather people and they create and convene. And if this is your first time seeing them, please know that they're there for you too, as you gather outside of this space. And with that, I want to say once again, we're thrilled that you're joining us for what is our 4th and final offering in this 4-part series of Poetry Unbound Plus. And it's been a collaborative effort between our religious and spiritual life team here at On Being and the Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage at the Washington National Cathedral. So with that, I want to invite our collaborator, Terry Lynn Simpson from the Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage at the National Cathedral to join us for a brief moment to say hello and welcome you all.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Lily and Pádraig. Welcome, everyone. As Ben said, if this is your 4th time, 3rd time, 2nd time being here, you know how wonderful these sessions have been. If it's your first time, you are in for a treat. I work with the Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage at Washington National Cathedral, where we are the commitment to being a spiritual home for the nation and a house of prayer for all people. So we are very pleased to be co-hosting this with the On Being Project and offering other programs throughout the year to help bring people together in spiritual community to share their stories and find doorways to grow closer to one another and transform the inner self so we can transform the world. So I welcome you. I invite you to learn more about the cathedral and the center. We have spiritual summer camp coming up in July, which I'm looking forward to. And I am extremely looking forward to our final conversation for this series of Poetry Unbound this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are. So thank you all.
Thanks so much, Terry Lynn. I mean, it's just a habit to say, you know, wherever you're from and name this evening or afternoon. So want to make sure everyone feels included. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And I won't add any other qualifications to that. Before I turn things over to Pádraig, as I know we're excited to get into the conversation, I'd ask for just a couple more minutes where I'm going to go over housekeeping details in terms of our Zoom experience. I want to make sure you know that, first of all, this is closed captioning is available. So you can access that by using the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and that's where you can turn this function on or off. We also invite you to turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable, so that we can see one another and have this intimate conversation experience together, almost feel like we're in the room. Of course, you're welcome to have your screen off too, and just listen in, whatever is most comfortable for you. As the event's going on, Lily will be spotlighting the speakers. It's called Speaker View. And you can either stay in this setting, or you can select Gallery View in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen in order to see everyone who's here in the room with us today. And do know that everyone but the speakers will be muted during the event. Later in the gathering, you will have the option to ask questions of our speakers directly, and we'll give you the option to unmute at that time. And just noting that this event is being recorded. So if you raise your hand to participate in the Q&A and are called upon, you are giving your permission to be recorded as part of this event. So with that, we are now going to turn off the chat until later when we get to the Q&A, so that we can provide a sort of focused and quiet space for the conversation we're about to witness. And I just want to invite you, now that we've gotten through all those announcements and gotten oriented to the space, if you would like, please join me in taking a grounding breath as we continue our time together. We always like to include a pause as we begin this event. And speaking of pause, some of you might be here because you heard about this event in the Pause on Being's weekly email newsletter, which Pádraig Ó Tuama is most typically the author of that newsletter. So with that, I want to introduce the host of our time together, Pádraig Ó Tuama, who is a poet, a public theologian, and he's the former leader of Corrymeela, Ireland's oldest peace organization. Here at the On Being Project, he is the host of Poetry Unbound, which is now in its 3rd season, and he is our resident poet theologian. Tonight, he is, see, there I go, tonight, this afternoon. I'm not going to call attention to that anymore, but he is joining us from his home, which is not where I live in Ireland, and he's our host of Poetry Unbound Plus. So, Pádraig, welcome.
Thanks very much, Ben and Lily and Terry-Lynn, and hello to everybody. It's lovely to be with you, whatever time of the day it is with you and wherever you are. I am thrilled to be with you once again for Poetry Unbound Plus. I have a deep interest in how it is that poets bring themselves to use the literature of the Bible in the question of their work. So many poetries make use of Greek mythology or of mythologies from different parts of the world. And what's extraordinary is the increasing amount of poets who are using biblical characters, biblical narratives and storylines in the context of their work. Some of them do that within the context of their own devotion, and some of them do that within the context of their own questions and doubt. And although paying deep and serious attention to what does it mean to take this literature, this biblical literature, seriously. And we are thrilled to have an opportunity tonight to talk with Diane Glancy and then to have some conversations with you. So Diane Glancy has published more than 60 books of poetry, fiction and non-fiction, as well as screenplays and plays, been involved in films as well. She was born in Missouri of Cherokee descent, and she now lives between Texas and Kansas. And she has won many awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Native Writers Circle of the Americas, and the Pablo Neruda Prize for Poetry, and the Cherokee Prize for Poetry, the Cherokee Medal of Honor. And so, Diane Glancy, we are thrilled to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Pádraig. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So I'm in Ireland, Diane. Do you want to tell us where you are?
I am in Shawnee Mission, Kansas, in my study. And I wanted to acknowledge the many peoples, the many tribes that have passed through this area: Delaware, Kansas, Kiowa, Osage, Pawnee, Wichita, Wyandot, Potawatomi, Cheyenne, Arapaho. among others.
Mm. There's such an extraordinary narrative of forced migration across what is now called the United States when it comes to paying attention to the people who are from there originally and then who were forced into moving across different parts of the United States. So we'll be talking about that within the context of how you bring Native American history into conversation with this book of Job, which is an amazing feat. I can't remember. I think I read a review of this book a few months back and just thought, I mean, I think honestly, my first thought was, what the hell is this? And so I got it and had it
Right.
read, I think, within the first day that I got it, and then immediately began to find out, how can we have a conversation? Um, I wondered about taking a hop, skip, and a jump through the book of Job first, just for anybody who wants to be oriented into the book. If you're thinking, oh, which one is that? So the book of
Yeah.
Job is a long poem from the Hebrew Bible. And in the first scene, really, God is boasting about how great Job is. You know, look at my favorite human being, Job, basically. But then there's this character in the court of God, the accuser, which in Hebrew is Has-Satan, where we get the word Satan. And the accusing character says, listen, God's only boasting because Job's got it easy. If Job didn't have it easy, Job would be not such a great person. And so God takes everything away from Job, his cattle, his 10 children, absolutely everything. And then Job is left, you know, in rags and covered in boils and no comfort and no income, nothing, abandoned even by the people who are still alive around him. And some of his acquaintances, first in a group of 3 and then latterly a fourth one individually, try to come and they comfort him, but they're not very comforting.
Right.
They're kind of explaining why they think God has brought this calamity. But Job demands an audience with God. And eventually God listens. And the first thing God says basically is, shut up and listen, Job. And then God speaks for 4 chapters and basically asks Job over and over again, were you there when the universe began? Were you there when I created the sea monsters? Were you there? Were you there? Did you see? Did you see? A great prose poem of ecological observation, but also of great, you know, universal loneliness too, perhaps. And Job obviously
Yes.
wasn't there. And then at the end, he's restored to glory. Nothing is answered, but Job is restored. What would you add to that hop, skip, and a jump through the book, Diane?
I think you did a good job.
A theology degree is useful for something.
But in the midst of his suffering, there were some flaws in his character that showed up. He wasn't really the perfect man after all. And he recognizes them and asks forgiveness. And all is restored. Then they have to worry about what to do with 14,000 sheep instead of only 7. So restoration was as much of a problem almost as the loss.
It's an extraordinary poem, really, that is seeking to understand, why do bad things happen to good people, or good-ish people, or kind of fine people, even if they're not perfect? You know, it's a fascinating conundrum of human history, isn't it?
I think that first poetry was a cry in the form of a question without words, just a sound, a query. Why am I suffering? Who am I in this world? What is this world? What is my relationship to God? And although that first poetry was not articulated, I think it came when Job heard that his flocks and herds were gone and his 10 children were killed. It's really not until chapter 3 that he begins to open his mouth with words. My roaring is poured out like water. And we don't get to hear the roaring, but you know it was there. I'm always fascinated by what is not mentioned or what is not included.
Yeah, and you've written some great poems about that. We'll be coming to some of those. I wonder if you could first talk about why you were drawn to this text.
I loved the tension that I felt. I loved the collaboration of all these different things coming together. I wanted to say, first of all, that my grandmother was a quilter, and she would take different pieces of material, plaids and florals and whatever, and cut them all up. In fact, I had to hold on to a pinafore or pajamas, or she would cut them up, and she would make squares and triangles, and I would watch her sort through them and begin to assemble. I love assemblage of fragments. And I do the same thing, only I use words. I cut the book of Job apart into a Sonata Sestina, a Villanelle essay, Native history, talking about the anguish of the first poetry, which was a cry without words. And the more I got into it, the more fascinating it became. I dissected and then put pieces back together again, like my grandmother, whose hand, by the way, stitched even until her death. I would see her go like that. So I will probably be doing like that, typing when at my death. But it's such a fundamental and profound book. You already mentioned, where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? And I have just looked at God's words in chapter 38 through 41, I believe. It's so fundamental to understand the filaments of the world. And another thing I loved was the translations, the difference in translation. The book is called Island of the Innocent, and that term is only there in the King James Version, not the Revised, not any other. So I love the changeability and the unreliability and what's here and what isn't, and how you have to sort of make you make your own fabric from which you have a quilt, from which you have a book.
I've got the quote here from the King James, because it's such a rich language in that English. When men are cast down, then you say, there is a lifting up, and he shall save the humble person. He shall deliver the island of the innocent, and it is delivered by the pureness of your hands. Extraordinary language.
But by the rest of Scripture, none of us are innocent. None of us are pure. We all are fallen. We all need a redeemer of some sort. So again, the contradiction and the tension and the fragments. And I love the construction of these different pieces to bring some sort of peace to the little struggling fragments.
I was part of charismatic Christianity for a long time. I'm not anymore, but regularly in that context, somebody would say, I have a word from the Lord for somebody.
Yes.
And they would feel like they had a particular piece of scripture, which was, I suppose, electrified for being delivered to an individual. And once in a room full of people, somebody who was speaking up at the front, who had a very forceful personality, said to a fellow next to me, I have a word of the Lord for you. And, he prepared himself to receive something perhaps encouraging. And it was the bit that God says to Job right at the beginning of God's speech. This person up the front said to your man next to me, God says to you, gird up your loins like a man. And the guy was petrified. I mean, understandably, it was quite an intimidating thing to say. And like the character of God as God speaks in this book, it isn't exactly friendly.
That's right.
Doesn't come across in the ways that the character of God is described in hymnody, for instance. There's a wildness to this God.
Yes, there is, and an unpredictability. And why would God, the magnificent God, have to brag to Satan, who's kind of creeping around the throne? What have you been up to, Satan?
Yeah.
Look at my servant.
Yeah, it's the most magnificent theater of theology, and there's all these exaggerations of character there. The God characters is exaggerated, the Satan character, even the Job and all these other characters, they're kind of hyperbolic experiences, perhaps, but they reveal the human condition, it seems to me. Is that how you read it too?
Oh, exactly. I think the book of Job is actually a drama of monologues. It's a play. It's just these voices. It's my turn to speak. You be quiet. Now it's my turn. All you guys be quiet.
Or shut up, as God says.
Yes, right. That's true. I know the charismatic church very well. And I'm in the Bible Belt in the center of the country. And when I'm in Texas, there is a Pentecostal church in my small town that I attend. And here in Kansas, I go to a large Methodist church. Yeah. I've attended the Presbyterian church. It's always been the Protestant Christianity, but that's always been where my faith is located.
I wonder if you could read the poem on page 45. She was first to speak.
She was first to speak. Job talks with his friends. Would they ask me to join them? I stand silent as a wind turbine on the high plains. Where are my words that lift the flat sheet of the world to address the suffering and dilemma? They leave me out to be without words. The stubbles hurt my feet. The universe ate our first children. We are all expendable. This mystery, this unanswerable, this old one up there who spoke the world into being. But I remained silent. What skies are these? To whom do they belong? Tell me where you are, what you see. What God is there with Satan rolling around his throne, saying, give me Job for a moment. Are there other worlds? Isn't this one enough? All those buzzings of comets and falling stars in the observatory in Uz, those astro heads, those Job's friends, I would join the arguments if I had their bag of words.
I love this poem. It seems to, on the one hand, be narrated from the kind of internal questions, perhaps, of Job's wife, who we'll come to later. But I also think of it coming from you, that you're saying that you and she have things to offer into this great theater of questions and theology. Is that one of the things that you're doing there, is inserting yourself into the drama of the Book of Job?
Very definitely. Maybe more me than her.
Are there other worlds? I love a bit of science fiction in the Book of Job.
Isn't this one enough?
Yeah. And is this a poetic exploration for you, or a theological one that's joining in, or is there, maybe there's not a difference?
I don't think there is a difference. I don't know. I worked on this book over the years. I would be driving someplace and a voice or some insight would come to me and I would make a note and then later get back here in my study and figure it out. Again, like my grandmother, putting a square here and a triangle there. And will this floral go with this plaid? No, but I'm going to use them together anyway. It is just the use of imagination. By the way, in the Bible, speaking of imagination, it takes a hit almost all the way through the Bible. Yeah. It is evil. Put it down. Don't let it grow. I think there's only one place I've found somewhere David said, keep in your imagination the things that God has done for your forefathers. And I think that's the only positive mention of imagination that I saw. So I'm also very careful. I don't want to disrespect my faith or God. But I did put a pink flamingo in Job's hacienda in his front yard. And I was driving on Highway 287 up toward Amarillo in Texas, and I saw a sign, Coots Ranch Road. And I wrote that down again in my notes and put it into the book. That's where Job lives in Uz, down Coots Ranch Road. So I took a lot of liberties. Yeah. I felt transgression many times, and yet, like my grandmother, I just kept cutting into the fabric of the text. And you're of Cherokee descent, and I read that at one point you were talking about locating yourself in this imagined landscape of this text of the Book of Job, and then you began to see horses and feathers and your own ancestors and the ancestors of other Indigenous people in what is now called the United States emerge into this landscape. Was that a surprise to you? Did you set out to do the Book of Job in conversation with Native history, or did that not come at all from somewhere else? They just began to show up. The longest poem was at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. I had been there and I had written about it. And I began to see the connection of Job's first poetry of wailing. Why is this happening? And it was easy to make that joining in there. And then some of my own moanings, my own roarings are in there too. You're right, it is a weaving of my voice, of their voice, of Job's voice, of all the voices of the land, the elements. I mean, God was quite a weatherman. He's talking about the storehouses of the hail and the snow, and some of my favorite passages are when he asked, do you know where the east wind comes from? Well, the east, but do you really know the foundation of it? Yeah, that's my favorite question too. It's like a trick question. Yeah, the east. Thanks, you've given me the answer in the question. Would you be able to read alternative facts on page 15? Yes. Of course, that came from the Trump administration and those alternative facts. A very clever engagement with politics and poetry and theology in what you're doing here. The friends sat 7 days with Job. the former owner of sheep and camels, now desolate also of children. Bildad reviewed his notes with friends, chomping at the dialogue. They preferred monologue. If we can speak to you, how could we hold back? Job 4:2. There was a lot of talking then. You have strengthened many. Now you fold when you're in trouble. You can't be innocent, Job. Zophar and Eliphaz agreed. Their different thoughts blaming Job in what could be called an unfair debate.
I was so struck by those last two words in reading this poem, Diane, an unfair debate, and thinking about the ways within which you bring Native American history into this consideration of the Book of Job, and that in public dialogue, it is an unfair dialogue because of the fact that it's happening in a European language. Like there are so many ways within which the beginning premise for what it means to engage with Native American histories is unfair because of everything that's been taken. Was that something that you were exploring in this? Because there's a great grief in the book. I found especially some of the parts where you're narrating landscape and buffalo grass. I found it overwhelmingly full of beauty and grief
And
and
grief.
sadness for all that was taken, not lost, but taken.
And as I read these poems, I feel a little undercurrent of anger. There's kind of a choppiness, I felt in my voice as I read. And there's also so much humor in the book of Job. A lot of times I would be reading, I can't think of a particular place right now, but I would be reading and almost chuckling about, I don't know, the irony or something of it. Maybe we'll come to that later and I can give you an example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I wonder if you could read "He Liveth," because this does contain what for some, I think my dad's in the room here, and I think it's his favorite line. I know that my Redeemer liveth.
Liveth,
and
shall stand at the latter day upon the earth.
Yeah, I mean that was a legal phraseology. It wasn't for foretelling a Messiah. It was an understanding of the legal system to say that, like an advocate, like an actual advocate, not a Satan, but a functional advocate who could advocate for Job in front of God. It's such an extraordinary thing, and within that, I found myself thinking, who had hoped for a redeemer during all the dispossessions and colonizations and genocides that happened all across what is now the United States?
He liveth. Were it a whale, the sea had bounds, but not suffering. Job lost all. His friends went bazooka with accusation. If Job did not understand at first, then who, I ask, could understand God? Who would brag to Satan, who in turn would say, give Job to me and see the stuffing in the overstuffed benefactor, who fed orphans and widows and was benevolent to the 9th degree in chapter 29th, the self-sung Job and all he did and was in us. It was there at midnight I found the exit to Walmart off Interstate 35 in Wichita, where I waited out the storm in my car until light. I know my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And thus it was in the deepest bite of rain that sadness was a perpendicular line upright to heaven. Because of Job's sorrow and restoration, I could handle the benefits of God, working on things until I came forth through loss with more than in the beginning. A shape in the ball of suffering like that in the furnace, but none were burned. Pádraig, I actually stopped the poem. I have a little mark here to stop it through loss with more than in the beginning, and not make that reference from the book of Daniel about them being in the furnace and all of that. So I almost stopped there, and I wish I had.
Okay.
Because sometimes you write beyond which you should have written.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can understand why you'd say that. The irony, I suppose, of finishing with "in the beginning" as well within that poem. Like a sadness was a perpendicular line upright to heaven. That is such a reflection, I suppose, of liturgy of lament, and how when I hear people who discount biblical literature and just say, oh, I've heard people say it's about a sky fairy who created everything. I just think you don't have to engage with the Bible or believe it, but it does need to be taken very seriously as literature. And one of the things that biblical literature is some of the most profound poetry of lament that I think the canon of poetry knows. And you're echoing this, a perpendicular line of a sadness was a perpendicular line up to heaven. And even the bit from the book of Daniel, a shape in the ball of suffering like that in the furnace. There is so much, even in this, you're telling the truth, but not asking questions, not asking answers. You're not demanding that God explain suffering, but somehow to speak of suffering can be a strange kind of consolation. Is that true for you when it comes to?
Yes, very much so.
Why is that true for you? Why is naming a lament enough?
I don't know. It just is. It gets back to writing poetry, writing down the words that carry the meaning and the shape of being. Aren't we speaking about on being?
Yeah.
For me, it was language and the elasticity of language and the purpose of language, which is to get us out of silence, I suppose, get us out of those preliminary cries of grief and give purpose and form and meaning. Wow. You know, unfortunately, the Native American does not look toward Christianity because of the boarding schools. You're very, very aware that recently 215 more bodies of children were found at Kamloops in British Columbia. But that is all over the country and America also. And so I received a Facebook posting because I'm known as a Christian. Think about this when you're in church, you know, and it showed the mass grave. And a Native cannot be a Christian. I'm not an enrolled Cherokee. We weren't in Oklahoma at that time. Yeah. There were skirmishes and disagreements, and my family had moved to Arkansas. So I am an enrolled member, unpapered. But a Native cannot be a Christian. I hear that. I've taken flack for years over my belief.
Yeah.
But my father had migrated to Kansas City and he worked in the stockyards. And I have been in church since I was born almost, and it's always been very meaningful to me. And I know it has not been to others, but my father worked in the stockyards. Blood was shed. Something had to die that we might live. And it was an easy transference into understanding Christianity as that same thing, that we are a broken person. I really even shouldn't say that, but I believe that. And you need an intercessor between. It's my Redeemer who liveth. And so it's always made sense. And I have found strength my whole long life through my Christian faith.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you in a sec to read from this excerpts from this overwhelmingly dense and beautiful and amusing and shocking essay called More Than Content is the Manner in Which It Is Held. And I think for folks who are listening, this is an invitation to hear an oral patchwork quilt of poetry, of prose, of scripture. And I feel like it's stepping inside your imagination, Diane, when I read this extraordinary piece. So we'd be thrilled to be taken on a little journey through your own unconscious theological framework in this piece.
And I'm not going to read it all because it's quite lengthy, but more than content is the manner in which it is held. I am writing about Job and the book of Job, which has haunted me. The poetics of it that takes the praxis of poetics to think in another way, to write about and still not thoroughly. Somehow it is tied up also in the Native American experience, haunted by the past. Haunted from the Mid-English haunten, Old French hanter, to frequent, Old Norse heimte, to lead home. A doublet of meaning which poetry explores, a creative bricolage of words pointing in various directions to the junction, itself sending others to various outward places. A pivotal book, Why Men Suffer, has been asked since the beginning. Right up there with Let There Be Light is followed by the suffering of that incoming light. And here we stand at the junction. Job's lamentations are similar to Native American lamentations. A wolf, I considered myself, but the owls are howling and the night I fear. collected by Francis Densmore from the Chippewa. It is said that many children on the train from North Dakota to Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania sang their death song after the loss of buffalo, their land and way of life, followed by separation from family. Job is an Old Testament Indian disposed of 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and 10 children. All of that lost to be educated in God's school of this is the way it is. It is for your own good, missionaries, teachers, evangelists, and zealots said. Poetry is a cartography, an imagined mapping of the wilderness for an understanding of the wilderness, or as much of the wilderness as can be understood. As if Christianity was closer to understanding and not full of nettles itself. As the many denominations and interpretations of the Christian text testify, maybe Christianity is more accessible than poetry, especially the abstract poetry that sometimes defies understanding, as if Christianity itself didn't defy understanding also. But God says that his thoughts are not our thoughts, neither are his ways our ways. Isaiah 55:8. We are made in his image, but there is a crawl space between the image and the real. As God sent his son to a beleaguered people who had created in the first place, whom God had created in the first place, with a full blast of the I will intact. But the loving God killed his son and placed judgment on him and then resurrected him and us with him, if we believe on his name. What is difficult about that? All right. Poetics has these particles within it, an eruption of a monumental understanding in language. We were made in the image of God, and as small particles of God, we could think for ourselves. The self-will is acted upon, and indeed we are the image of the free-willed free thinker, but without the stuff of holiness knocked out of us by our decision to follow our own way. But all is not lost after 4,000 years of prophets bellowing their warnings of doom. Eventually, Jesus came to earth to clarify. He was a replica of God. To believe in him was to believe in the God we could not see, and thereby we are saved from the everlasting damnation we have found ourselves in, or have found in ourselves. This is the last paragraph I will read. When tribal rolls were taken, native names were shortened. Bird with yellow streak down its tail was written Yellowtail, an erasure of identity and imagination. The bird with yellow streak down its tail captured a phenomenon. As the bird changed into flight, there was a flash of yellow feathers. The name had momentum, a structure of going into motion. It was what was taken away with the name change. Other subtleties of verbiage integral to a sense of purpose were lost. Exploration of those rifts, in part, is what poetics has in its destination. It also was the purpose of Job's suffering, in that he would travel the rift between man's understanding of suffering, i.e., Job had sinned, and God's purpose in Job's suffering, i.e., that Job might see more clearly his place in God's being.
Thank you very much, Diane. There's so much tension. So you've just been reading from that that prose poem, that essay that's in the towards the beginning of the book in the second section. There's so much tension in there. Even that last bit that you wrote about the name being shortened, and I'm struck by how much tension you carry in your life. You know, you spoke about being papered, not enrolled in the Cherokee Nation, and you hold a deep devotion to Christianity. But I know that for some people in the poetry community, they might be suspect about your Christianity.
True.
But some people in the Christian community are suspect about what you do with poetry. You know, there is lament and loneliness in so much of your expression of faith. And even in the book,
Very
over and over
true.
again, you're driving. There's your car is such a character in this book, which I find so funny in a certain sense, ironic to bring a car into the book of Job. But there's solitude in that. And would you say that solitude is one of the things that you brought to this text of the book of Job? And what function does solitude have?
I wanted to say, first of all, that I'm often left out of the Christian community too. Someone asked me at a journal, which I'm not going to mention, asked me to write that article, or an article about poetry and faith. And I did. And then they rejected it. They said it was way too far out. That was more than they really wanted. So being left out, the solitude is very important. I think part of what I've done all my life is write about historical voices that did not have a chance to speak. Jo'ora certainly is one of them in this book. And I've done Sacagawea on the Lewis and Clark Journal, Carrie Tekakwitha, who was, I guess you would say, evangelized by the Jesuits in the 17th century. So I get in my car and I travel back along the land where these events took place, because the land is a living being also. It carries memory. It will share with you if you are patient enough. And I have to be by myself. I can't be with anybody else, or I would be talking. And that solitude in which worlds exist, of the past and the present and the imagined and so forth, I would not have that. So for some reason, I've been at the very center of all these outings. You know, I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not that, nor I'm that, but I'm part of them all. And that solitude, again, my grandmother's quilt, as she sat down there on the farm in solitude, sewing and sewing year after year. I have some of her quilts. I keep them in a box because I want to preserve them. I'm not sure why, but I do. And solitude is very important, because that's where my imagination lives more than any place, I think. So I'm very grateful for
even
it.
deeper than, because I can understand and imagine that lots of those experiences of not being fully recognized can feel like rejection, but you seem to go deeper than rejection into solitude.
I mean, the whole world is a place of expulsion, isn't it? From the Garden of Eden, if you're a Christian, to even our lives, we're always being pushed out and having to find new territories in which to exist, or having our belief system, our being questioned, and having to redefine ourselves as time goes on. And as you age, you're always looking for differences. So it's worked out certainly to my benefit, although I do miss voices. I think that's one of the first reasons I started writing plays, was for all those voices that I was not a part of, or that I missed out on, or that I could hear in this peripheral vision of imagination that I have.
I'm not surprised that you turned to the Book of Job then. As you say, it's an extraordinary theatre of monologues. One of the monologues that is left out, or even a character, is Job's wife. I wonder if you'd be able to read the poem Addendum. And just to let folks know, we'll have one question after this poem, and then we'll open it up for Ben to curate some questions from the audience. So if you have some questions, you can raise your hand or put them into the chat. So the Addendum on page 169.
I would say the voice that shows up most in this book is Jo'ora, is Job's wife. She was the first to speak. And this piece is called Addendum, and it's after restoration, when she looks out in the sheep pasture and sees 14,000 sheep. Addendum. Dear Lord, is this it? I expected more over-wordy friends, more trees blown down from the whirlwind that took our children. You were on a roll. Have you seen the pasture after servants burned with 7,000 sheep, those fragments? I write to you as inquiry. Lord, look at the animals crowded in the field, grumbling every day. What will we do with all that? Is it possible for you to take back? At least the friends made their muffled, understated exit. Job changed after the trials you allowed. He has enlarged his understanding while I remain a bitter berry on your vine. Signed, Jo'ora, Job's wife.
What was it about seeing from her point of view that intrigued you so much, Diane?
Because she was done a great injustice. Her only words are curse God and die. And there was never really any look, in fact, in much of the Bible, into a woman's point of view or voice or understanding. I noticed at the very end of the book of Job, the three daughters, she also got to give birth to 10 more children after she lost her first ones, and their names, the young
Yeah.
women's named Jemima, Keziah, and Karen Happuch.
Yeah.
And it also says that Job allowed them to have part of his inheritance,
Mm.
which was not allowed in the Bible either. Women got nothing. So that showed an enlarged understanding of Job. But anyway, the left out ones, as in it, looking back in history, I mentioned Sacagawea, Kateri Tekakwitha, the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears that left few notes. All those that did not get a chance to speak. I've always been aware of these holes, these blank places, these barren places in history. And so I certainly wanted to give her a voice also, because as a Christian, I believe she was a real person. I believe there was a man like Job, and he had a wife, and she had opinions. She suffered as much as he did.
Yeah.
And I think she represents the times we suffer and don't really understand why, whereas Job was plugged into the reasons for his suffering.
What would a world without the poetry of the Book of Job be like, do you think? Like, what is the gift that this extraordinary book gives, whether or not somebody is involved in religion, but like simply the poetry of the book and the kind of the ethical and justice-based questions of the book? What does it contribute to the world?
I think the language, the poetry of it, I really made notes. I would have rather read some of Job than my own. But when he asks questions like, have you entered into the springs of the sea, or have you walked in the search of the depth? I mean, that's all a poet. You can hear the rhythm in that line. Have the gates of death been opened to you, or have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Where is the way where light dwells? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? And so forth and so forth. It just makes you think so much deeper than I would have on my own, and to try and ferret out those places with a poetic language. I think this book is genius. I think it is profound. It is fundamental. It gets to the very root and nature of the human being and our place in the world and the world itself and the universe. He talks about Orion, the stars. I mean, this book cannot be contained in littleness. And there are little funny places like Leviathan. God takes a whole chapter almost to define the Leviathan, and he sneezes and lightning comes from his mouth. And the behemoth, I love those two animals, whatever they are.
Yeah.
So it's so enriching and enlarging. I would have been a smaller person without it.
And on that note, let's turn to some questions that Ben is going to curate from our audience.
Thank you, Pádraig. Thank you, Diane. So I'll offer some guidelines or to orient you to our Q&A time. And as I'm sharing these, you're welcome to begin dropping questions into the Q&A. So the two options for how you ask your questions: one, you can use the raise your hand function in Zoom. And depending on your version of Zoom, it's either at the bottom of the participants panel when you click the reactions button, or it's on the far left. So there's a reactions button, you click it and you'll see raise hand. If we call on you, we will spotlight your video and give you the option to unmute and ask your question directly. And a reminder that by raising your hand, you are consenting to be on screen live and in our YouTube recording. And second, you can ask your question in the chat. And if you don't want to be spotlighted or can't use the raise your hand function, that's fine. Just offer it in the chat, and I'll do my best to sift through those and bring those questions to Diane. And we'll have time for about 3 or 4. So we probably won't be able to get to everyone's, but thank you for bringing the questions and thoughts that you have to this space. So with that, why don't, while I have a chance to look through some of the questions, I do see Jay with a raised hand. So Jay, I'll ask you to unmute and invite you to bring your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Pádraig, as well. And of course, Diane. I had a question, but I also want to make a parenthetical. I can only be parenthetical on such a huge topic, but you seem to have some worry about imagination and whether imagination seen positively or negatively. And I need to say that, you know, in the Hebrew Bible and in the Hebrew tradition, everything from the plain text of the dreams and interpretation of dreams that occur in many of the narratives to the rich tradition of rabbinic commentary to Kabbalistic and then Hasidic. I mean, they run riot with imagination. So I don't think anyone needs to apologize for the text and imagination. And my question, and maybe related also to what Robin just asked in the chat, the notion of translation, and obviously the importance of, words as the shape of being, your bag of words, etc. I'm wondering if you only rely on translations, not the Hebrew, and also if you are expert on translations, I'm wondering if you're familiar with the Robert Alter translation and what you think of that particular one.
No, I am not. Only with the Bible and the different translations, the Christian.
Well, yeah, his translations now of the whole Hebrew Bible, but also he has the Book of Job in his collection called Books of Wisdom. I would encourage you to read it. I mean, it's highly informed, obviously, by Jewish commentary and perceptions, but it's quite literary and quite amazing.
Thank you. I've made a note of that.
Is Robert Alter's translation the main one that you'd point to, Jay? I love that translation.
Yes, the Robert Alter. I mean, he now has the entire Hebrew Bible translated in 3 volumes, but he also has certain books translated, and he's got a collection called the Wisdom Books, which includes the Book of Job.
Thanks for highlighting that, Jay.
Thank you, Jay. So one question we have has to do with, you talked about how you often, I mean, by driving even, you trace the steps of sort of unheard of or historical figures who have not had a chance to, or for us to hear their voices. The question is, how do you sort of begin to discern which voices are speaking to you? Does that begin by beginning to travel a certain journey or immersing yourself in certain literature, like the literature of the Bible? Or is there some other process that you use to begin to tune into the unheard voices?
Well, many different processes. For Sacagawea, for instance, in Stoneheart, I knew that the bicentennial, the 1804 to 1806 Corps of Discovery was coming. And so in 2000, I began getting in my car and driving the Columbia and the Missouri rivers to Fort Clatsop and back, following the land and picking up her voice, which was left out mostly of the journals. And then Kateri take it with it. I can't remember how I did that. And of course, I know the history of the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears. So that was on my map for a long time. And I travel out across the plains, mainly to massacre sites, places of the great battles. And I don't hear anything, thank goodness. But in my imagination, again, it's that haunting that I mentioned in More Than Content, is the manner in which it is said. Whatever haunts me or sticks with me like a cocklebur that I can't quite get rid of. And I don't know, there are just so many voices that would love attention. And sometimes Pádraig has a line somewhere, never open this door. What is your line? It's close to that. Don't open this door.
Never open up the door.
Never open up the door. And often I feel when I'm tempted to write about something, I thought, this is going to be difficult. Do I really want to open that door? And as I say, yes, I'm going to take the risk. So it's just, I've written so long and in so many various ways. And I'm so thankful for that. It never gets old in the many years. Each book is new. Each book is back to start, back to blank, back to, can I do this one more time? This act of transgression, stepping into other people's lives and saying what they thought. It takes a lot of nerve to do that. You'd be better off not doing that, not opening that door. You take a lot of criticism too for it, especially from historians. You can't do that. I've been told that before at historical conferences. Nobody knows what Sacagawea said. You cannot take that leap into her voice. So I'm very aware of opposing opinions. And nevertheless, I transgress on.
Diane, I see, Richard, your hand is raised, and I'll invite you to bring your question.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for this lovely experience. I did post my question in the chat as well, because I wasn't sure I would get the honor of actually saying it. But I just want to say that as a white male, American Catholic, cis male, I find there's a really treasure in the faith of our African American brothers and sisters, that understanding of sorrow and misery and coming through tribulation. And I'm curious in hearing you talk about this idea of, the people of Native extraction who are Christian, and kind of the conflict between those who say you can't be Christian and a Native person. I'm curious what you see as the contribution of Christians who are of Native descent in America to our understanding of the faith of God's word, in particular, that we may be missing as white males, and in this society, and maybe also those of Native background who aren't Christian, what they kind of miss and what Native American Christianity looks like.
Well, for me, it's been Christianity has been survival. It's been purpose. It's been faith that has gotten me through a lot of difficult times. When I was divorced and faced nothing and had 2 children, it was faith. I remember walking and saying, God, if you take your hand off me 1 minute, I will perish. And that's just one small example of the many. I went to Minnesota for 20 years out of the warmth of Oklahoma, became a professor. I had no idea where and what and when and where. I was given a scholarship to the University of Iowa. That did not come from me. I think that was another answer to prayer. I have just experienced a long and fruitful and amazing life that God has blessed with abundance. And by the way, I just finished a new book on Ada Blackjack, who was an Inupiat who went with 4 explorers to Wrangell Island, 1921 to 23. She was the only survivor. And she had been raised in a Methodist mission in Nome, Alaska. She learned to write and she learned faith in Christ. And those last months when she was alone on Wrangell Island before the rescue boat could get through the ice after 3 years, it was her faith. You begin to see the word Jesus. You begin to see these words of faith come up in her crude writing. And so I had that experience. It was a loss of culture. She had trouble hunting. She said, I was not raised with my tribe. So there's a great loss. And at the same time, and if you believe in eternity, eternal life through Christ, I mean, that is a very definite Christian promise. And I know not all accept that, but for me, it has worked. So I thank the church. I mean, everything I know, all these theological ideas came from what I've heard from ministers and Bible studies and my own readings and my own transgressions into a Bible that was not mine. And I found life and hope and joy and resilience and certainty and life.
Thank you for your question, Richard, and thank you, Diane. Earlier, you said the whole world is a place of expulsion. And I'm seeing a question here from, and for you, that's been from, at times, from the Christian community, from the poetry community, from the history community, from all these different places. And we have a question here sort of related to that from Jennifer Kwong, who is so struck by your consciousness of being on the edges of the various communities of which you are part, and the solitude that brings. And the question is this: do you feel the desire or calling to bridge these disparate communities or bring them together in some way? And if so, how does that manifest in your life and practice? And perhaps we could even say in your writing.
I think there's been a failure anytime I've tried. For years, I went to a little fundamental church in St. Paul, Minnesota, and now I go to one in Texas. And what I do seems close to sin to them. You know, the use of the imagination, this writing stuff that you do, it just does not fit. And as Pádraig already mentioned, a lot of poets think, why are you writing about that stuff? And I just don't really bother with trying to integrate communities or speaking to them. I just live in my little isolated fragments, because so much creative work comes from that brokenness and that expulsion. I mean, I was expelled from a marriage. I was expelled from when I retired, although I still do teach. And I don't know, just And my father was always transferred in the stockyards. Those old stockyard buildings were wood. And as they began to deteriorate, it was his job to move around, deciding which would be raised and which could go on a few more years. And so I lived in Kansas City, St. Louis, Denver, Chicago, Sioux City, Indianapolis, Reading, Pennsylvania. And then I've moved a lot in my own life. So that migration, that sense of moving on, that sense that my sense of wholeness is in the moving. My sense of place is in migration. My sense of wholeness is in my grandmother's quilts of all these different pieces, none of which really go together, but make a lovely pattern. And so I've just come to be at peace with the brokenness, with the expulsion. And someday when I die, I will be expelled from this life and to see what is there, another journey.
I'm curious, Diane, whether you find the ways that God is put into character in the book of Job sufficient, or whether that language too needs to migrate. Just as an example, like you were speaking about the beauty of the King James translation from the Hebrew Bible. This is from chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is it that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together for glory? Like, do you find that a character of God that needs to migrate to when it comes to the understanding? Or do you, I want to know what you think of the speaking voice of God in this poem.
Thank you for reading that. That, as you were reading that, I thought, this is our benevolent, wonderful, merciful God who's pushing us, expelling us from him. Listen, you little peewee people down there on earth, I am God. He's really very puzzling in the book of Job, tempting Satan and causing so much suffering, although Job did benefit. And you see a different kind of God. And I've read enough commentary on the book of Job, who wrote it, when it was written, the primitive concept of God. I mean, I've seen it torn apart and everything that you can imagine. So you tell me what you think. You answer your question.
I love the book of Job, and I suppose I do see it as a piece of theater, and all of the characters are a certain kind of, I know North America doesn't have a Christmas pantomime tradition, but a kind of a slightly exaggerated, in fact, completely exaggerated, hyperbolic caricaturing of self. And God in this is being pushed to the edges of God to a kind of a boastful, but almost immature in boasting, the way that, even in Eden, God says to Adam and Eve, eat everything, but not those. Of course, then that's the only thing you're going to think of. So in this situation here, we have God going, check out my perfect friend Job. Of course, the accuser is going to go, well, he's only perfect because he's got everything easy. So there's this idea, I think, that even the God character in the book of Job is bringing people to the edge of that God character, because it's entertaining and magnificent, the voice of that character, but is also inviting us all into something more.
I love God when he gets exasperated. That's one of my favorite places, which he certainly did at the end of Job. I was talking to a Jesuit about the Native American boarding school problem. And I said, I've always heard it from the Native point of view, but I can just imagine what it was for those refined and intellectual Jesuits to be sent out on the prairie with the savages. It must have been almost more than they could have endured. But anyway, these problems of coexisting.
And what else would you want to say about the importance of this book when it comes to the question of its poetry? If you were to speak about its literary value, what would you want to say?
I think the expediency that I get from the book of Job, whenever I'm down or thinking, I can just open the book and read a few lines, and there is that wealth of meaning, of language, the depth, and that connection. This is where I belong. This is my home. I know where I am when I read the Bible, the book of Job. It is home for me.
Are there other texts of the Bible that you find yourself kind of burrowing your way into and looking at other, or currently, like, are there projects that you have going on where you're thinking about a particular book?
Yes, I'm in a Bible study, and that's where the Jesuit was. And we've read the book of Mark, and now we're in Acts. And I've done some work on biblical women too, their point of view.
Yeah.
Tabitha, what it was like to go to heaven and find a lovely closet there and have to come back to earth when Peter called her back from death.
Yeah.
She was very upset. And so I just keep marching on.
I'm so struck with the depth of your devotion. And is that a devotion of tension, devotion to giving yourself to the text and the tradition that's been so meaningful for you, but also stretching it to try to put in voices that are left out? Is that a comforting experience for you to be in that kind of posture of both devotion and tension, or do you find it uncomfortable?
I find it very satisfying, and I do it all the time because of need. I've always found that life is much bigger than I am. And when you're out on the prairie by yourself in a storm and you're looking for this voice along the edge of the Missouri River, it's just always been a comfort. I've needed it. I have been very needy, and all the years I taught, it's not easy. So out of my need is how I came and how I have stuck with faith.
Thank you very much, Diane. We'll be coming back to you in just a short while for a final poem, but I'm going to hand over to Ben, who's got a few things to say first.
Yeah, in a moment, Diane's going to close out our time with a poem, but first, a few thank yous and closing announcements. Of course, first of all, thank you, Diane Glancy, for joining us today and opening up your poetry and also your stories and your life to us this evening. Thanks, Pádraig, for hosting us in this time. And on behalf of the On Being Project and the Washington National Cathedral, we want to thank you all for attending, for your presence, your questions, even the ones we didn't get to. And it's just been such a gift to have you be a part of this whole series with us. I know some of you have been here for multiple gatherings, others this is your first time, but we're so grateful that you made space to be here, and hope that you found these conversations to be nourishing and also sort of to grow your imagination. So Lily is going to be adding a short survey into the chat. There's going to be a link, and it's right there where it says, let us know what you thought of this gathering. If you click on that, you can give us your feedback and let our social healing team know who you are and what might serve you in this moment. Lily and I would especially love to hear from you if you're interested in connecting with our religious and spiritual life team. And by the way, I can't move on without thanking Lily Benowitz, who's in the chat, who's been holding it down. She's the one who's been responding to your emails. She's coordinated so much of this event, all 4 of these events. Lily Benowitz, thank you so much. We're so grateful for how you've made this opportunity possible for all of us. Another thing Lily's behind is helping make sure these things get on YouTube. So keep an eye out on YouTube for recordings. I know the Washington National Cathedral posts it, and we do as well. And another note is, in the coming weeks, we are actually putting together a page on the On Being Project website that will house all of our Poetry Unbound Plus conversations. So when that's live, and you'll hear about it in the pause and some other channels, you'll be able to find the recordings. There'll be some quotes, there'll be some poetry readings, and it'll be a great resource for you to revisit what we've explored together and to share that with others. So we encourage you to do that. And the last little announcement I have is just related to Pádraig's fantastic Poetry Unbound podcast, available wherever podcasts are found. And just check out season 3 or start with season 1 if you haven't heard it before. I think we're about 12 episodes into season 3. So make sure to listen to that. You'll find a similar quality to the types of conversations and explorations about poetry that we've had here. So with that, Pádraig, I'll hand it back to you, and you and Diane can close our time together.
Thanks very much, Ben. I want to add my voice too of thanks to Terry Lynn from the Washington National Cathedral, and to Ben and to Lily and to Chris Heagle and all of the On Being team and everybody who's been involved, and to the audiences who've been to one or two or three or four of these. It's been such an enriching thing. And to Diane, you have given such power in this extraordinary book. I remember exactly where I was sitting and how I was feeling as I was going through this book and reading the book of Job in a new way, with new conversation partners, with you in there and your car and the histories you carry in your heritage too, and the agonies and the trauma and accusations of all of that, and ways within which sometimes lament needs to be enough because it's all we have. Because there are unrecoverable things in the world. You have done so much extraordinary work in this book, and thank you for the integrity that for people of deep devotion, as well as people for whom devotion isn't an interest, to people across all of that spectrum, you have given something of great profundity when it comes to asking questions about lament and accusation and raising up one's own voice in the world. So thank you. I know you want to finish off with a poem which makes reference to the cover of the book. This is the book published by Turtle Point Press, Island of the Innocent here. I hope you can see that. But I think Ben is going to bring up the cover as you offer this final poem as a blessing. Diane.
In 1976, I bought William Blake's illustrations of the book of Job, and illustration 11 is on the cover. And whenever I would move over the years, I would look through the book again. And what has it been, 40 years that I've had that book? And finally it began. With dreams upon my bed. He's on a bedroll like any cowboy on the range. But here he's placed by a lake of fire. God and the serpent hover over him. It is God, the accuser, who points to the tablets above the zigzag lightning crawling through the sky. Near Job's bedroll, the waves are tongues of flames from which two demons reach up and hold on to Job as if to pull him below. The third demon simply lifts his chains to show him. God has a foot cloven as a cattle, or worse, as if he's part devil himself. Maybe it's not God, but Satan transformed into an angel of light. No, that can't be right. The shining one is God, under whom Job lies flat on his bedroll, with the end curled up for a pillow. Job is sandwiched between God and the flames. Job is seeing what Job is made of. But this servant who exalts himself above all that is called God or is worshipped rests his head on God's arm. But it's God's arm that separates Job and the serpent. Not all is lost, but still, what terror, what blaze of terrible thoughts. God wearing a serpent as if a foxtail stole. God letting Satan tempt Job, taking all but his life. What a mixed message to sort out. What effort to understand the purpose of hoof and snake, stone tablet and lightning. How can anyone get near the sheltering, dangerous God and trust in his benevolence? What odd message is in this illustration in black and white? Yet Job holds the hoof pick of his words. Though worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God. If ever a cattle drover had a song.
Diane Glancy, many, many thanks for the gift of this final poem and all these poems that you've offered us and your time. And good night to everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are, and many thanks for coming. All the best from Ireland and from the Washington National Cathedral, the On Being team, and from everybody inside here. A great joy to be with you.